The sound of gunfire had finally stopped. Sergeant Takashi Yamamoto pressed his back against the wet rock and tried to count how many men he had left. 3 days ago, his unit had 42 soldiers. Now he could see only 8 faces in the darkness of the cave. The American forces had landed on their small Pacific island 5 days earlier, and the battle had been brutal that Takashi's hands shook as he checked his rifle. 2 bullets left. Around him, his men were in worse condition. Private Hiroshi Tanaka, barely 20 years old, had a piece of shrapnel in his shoulder. The young soldier's face was pale, and blood had soaked through the makeshift bandage. Corporal Kenji Sato, their medic, had used the last of their medical supplies 2 days ago. Now he could only watch Hiroshi suffer. Outside the cave, American voices called out in a language Takashi didn't understand. He knew what they were saying, though. Surrender. The word felt like poison in his mind. Every Japanese soldier knew the code. Death before dishonor. Capture was the ultimate shame. But as Takashi looked at Hiroshi's face twisted in pain, he wondered what honor meant when all his men would die for nothing. The year was 1943, and the war in the Pacific was turning against Japan. American forces were island-hopping, taking back territory piece by piece. Takashi had heard whispers that the Americans had endless supplies, ships that covered the ocean, and planes that blocked out the sun. He had thought it was enemy propaganda. Now, after seeing wave after wave of American soldiers with new weapons and full bellies, he wasn't sure anymore. Kenji crawled over to Takashi. Sergeant, Hiroshi needs a real doctor. If we don't surrender, he'll die by morning. The medic's voice was quiet but firm. Half our men are wounded. We have no food, no water, no ammunition. What are we fighting for now? Takashi closed his eyes. He thought of his wife and daughter back in Osaka. He had promised to return with honor. How could he face them as a prisoner? But then he thought of Hiroshi's mother, waiting for a son who would never come home if they stayed in this cave. An explosion shook the cave entrance. Dust and rocks fell from above. The Americans were getting impatient. Soon they would throw grenades or use flamethrowers. Takashi had seen what those weapons did to men trapped in caves on other islands. It was not an honorable death. It was just burning alive while screaming. White flag, Takashi said quietly. The words felt strange in his mouth. We surrender. His men stared at him. Some looked relieved. Others looked away in shame. Private Tanaka started crying. Whether from pain or dishonor, Takashi couldn't tell. Kenji quickly tore a piece of white cloth from his medical bag and tied it to a bamboo stick. They emerged slowly from the cave, hands raised. The sunlight hurt Takashi's eyes after days in darkness. American soldiers surrounded them immediately, weapons pointed. Takashi expected to be shot. Instead, a tall American officer stepped forward. He was clean, his uniform was pressed, and he looked well-fed. The contrast to Takashi's starving, filthy men was shocking. Lieutenant James Cooper, the American said through an interpreter, "You men are now prisoners of war. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. Put down any weapons." Takashi and his men dropped their rifles. American medics rushed forward immediately to help Hiroshi. They worked quickly, cutting away his bloody uniform, cleaning the wound, injecting something that made Hiroshi's face relax for the first time in days. Takashi watched in amazement. The Americans were helping their enemies. The prisoners were given water. Real, clean water in canteens. Takashi hadn't tasted fresh water in a week. They had been drinking from muddy puddles. He drank slowly, trying not to be sick. Then came food. Crackers, canned meat, chocolate. Chocolate. Takashi hadn't seen chocolate since before the war started. His men ate like starving dogs, which they were. As they marched through the jungle to the American base camp, Takashi saw things that made him question everything. Boxes of supplies stacked higher than a man. Trucks carrying more food than his entire unit had seen in months. American soldiers throwing away half-eaten meals. The waste alone could have fed his company for days. The base camp. More surprises waited. American soldiers sat in the shade, drinking cold beverages, reading letters from home. Some were playing cards. Others were listening to music from a radio. They looked relaxed, like men on vacation, not soldiers in the middle of a war. Takashi and his men were put in a holding area, a fenced section with tents. Guards watched them but didn't beat them. More medics came to check everyone. They spoke through interpreters, asking about injuries and illnesses. Kenji watched everything the American medics did with wide eyes, That night, lying on a cot with a real blanket, Takashi stared at the canvas ceiling of the tent. His stomach was full for the first time in months. Hiroshi was sleeping peacefully after the American medics had properly treated his wound. His men were alive, but the shame of surrender burned in his chest. What confused him most was the treatment. He had been told Americans were barbaric, that they tortured prisoners and killed them for sport. But these Americans had given them food, water, and medical care within hours of capture. They had not been beaten or humiliated. What kind of enemy does this? Sleep finally came to Takashi, but his dreams were troubled. He dreamed of his family, of Japan, of honor and shame. When he woke, he didn't know that tomorrow would bring even more shocking discoveries about his captors and their strange, abundant world. The transport ship cut through the Pacific waves under heavy guard. Takashi sat in the cargo hold with 73 other Japanese prisoners, all captured from different battles across the island chain. The smell of unwashed bodies filled the tight space, but compared to the caves and trenches, this seemed almost comfortable. They had been given water twice a day and fed regularly. The food was strange but filling. Hiroshi sat next to Takashi, his shoulder properly bandaged now. The young private looked healthier already. The infection that had been killing him was gone, thanks to American medicine. "Sergeant, where do you think they're taking us?" Hiroshi whispered. "I heard the guards say Hawaii," Kenji answered from across the hold. The medic had been learning English words by listening carefully. A big camp there. Many prisoners. Hawaii. Takashi had heard of it. American territory in the middle of the Pacific. Once it had seemed impossibly far away, a fantasy place where Americans lived in luxury. Now they were sailing toward it as prisoners. He wondered if he would ever see Japan again. An older prisoner named Nakamura sat in the corner. He had been captured 3 months earlier on Guadalcanal. The other prisoners asked him questions about what to expect. "The Americans are strange," Nakamura said. "They follow rules. Many rules. They write everything down. They count everything. They have rules for how to treat prisoners, and they mostly follow these rules." "Do they torture?" a young prisoner asked nervously. "No torture," Nakamura said. "But they ask many questions. They want information about Japanese forces, positions, numbers. Some men talk, some don't. If you don't talk, they just write that down and ask again later. No beating." He paused. "The hardest part is the shame. Living as a prisoner when you should have died with honor. That shame never leaves." The ship rocked in rough seas. Some men became sick. American medics came below with medicine and clean buckets. They showed no disgust, just professional efficiency. Takashi watched them work and felt confused again. In the Japanese military, weakness was punished. Here, the sick were helped. After 5 days at sea, they saw land. The island of Oahu rose from the ocean, green mountains touching white clouds. As the ship entered Pearl Harbor, Takashi saw something that made his breath stop. Ships. Hundreds of ships. Warships, cargo ships, transport ships. The harbor was so full of vessels, it looked like a floating city. And beyond the harbor, he could see the city of Honolulu, buildings stretching for miles. That Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor had been less than 2 years ago, in December 1941. Takashi had heard it was a great victory, that the American Pacific Fleet was destroyed. But looking at this harbor now, filled with ships, he saw no evidence of destruction. The Americans had rebuilt everything. Or maybe they had so many ships that losing some didn't even matter. The thought was terrifying. The prisoners were unloaded onto trucks. As they drove through American military bases, Takashi couldn't stop staring. Mountains of supplies sat everywhere. Food, ammunition, vehicles, fuel barrels, medical equipment. Warehouses bigger than any building in his hometown. American soldiers everywhere, all looking well-fed and relaxed. Some waved at the trucks. Others barely looked up from their card games. The POW camp sat in a valley surrounded by green mountains. Barbed wire fences enclosed rows of wooden barracks. Guard towers stood at each corner, but the guards looked bored, not cruel. The trucks stopped at the main gate, and the prisoners were ordered out. Lieutenant Cooper was there, the same officer who had accepted their surrender. He stood with several other American officers and men in civilian clothes who spoke Japanese. "Welcome to camp on WWII," one interpreter said. "You will be processed, given medical examinations, and assigned to barracks. Follow instructions, and you will be treated fairly." The processing took hours. Each prisoner had his photograph taken, a strange experience for men who had rarely seen cameras. They were asked their names, ranks, units, and ages. Everything was written on cards and filed away. The Americans seemed obsessed with paperwork. They had forms for everything. Medical examinations came next. American doctors looked at each prisoner carefully. They checked teeth, eyes, ears, and skin. They found lice on almost everyone. Skin infections were common. Many prisoners were dangerously thin. Kenji watched the examinations with great interest, comparing American medical methods to what he had learned in the Japanese army. Malnutrition, severe, a doctor said about Takashi, writing notes. Vitamin deficiency, parasites, needs delousing and dental work. The doctor spoke to Takashi through an interpreter. When did you last have a proper bath? Takashi thought about it. A real bath, not just washing in a stream or with a bucket of cold water. Maybe 6 months ago, he said, before my unit left for the islands. The doctor nodded and wrote more notes. Tomorrow you'll be cleaned up properly. Tonight, rest and eat. You're safe here. Safe. The words sounded strange. How could he be safe in an enemy prison camp? But as Takashi was led to his barracks, given a thin mattress and a blanket, he felt something he hadn't felt in months. The fear that had lived in his chest since the war began seemed to ease slightly. The barracks held 30 men. Some had been prisoners for months. They helped the newcomers settle in and explain the camp rules. Work details start next week, one prisoner said. Mostly farm work, growing food. The Americans pay us in camp money that we can use at the canteen for cigarettes and snacks. Pay us? Hiroshi asked, confused. They pay prisoners. Strange, right? But yes, they follow Geneva Convention rules. Prisoners who work get paid. That night, the guards brought dinner. Rice, canned vegetables, and some kind of meat. Not much meat, but more than Takashi had eaten in months of fighting. The men ate quickly, still not trusting that more food would come tomorrow. As darkness fell, Takashi lay on his mattress and listened to the camp sounds. American guards walking their rounds. Prisoners talking quietly. Somewhere, a radio played American music. Tomorrow they would be cleaned and deloused, whatever that meant. Some prisoners were nervous about it. Rumors spread that it might be a trick, that the Americans would do something terrible, but Takashi was starting to think the real shock wasn't cruelty. It was seeing the enemy as human beings who followed rules and had resources beyond imagination. That truth was more disturbing than any torture could be. Morning came with the sound of a whistle. Takashi woke confused for a moment, then remembered where he was. A prisoner. The shame hit him again, but so did the smell of coffee from the camp kitchen. Real coffee. He hadn't smelled that in years. After a breakfast of oatmeal and bread, the guards lined up all the new prisoners outside the barracks. Sergeant Bobby Martinez walked down the line, checking names on his clipboard. He was a Mexican-American from Texas, and unlike many guards, he tried to communicate with the prisoners. He knew a few Japanese words and used lots of hand gestures. Today, clean, Bobby said in broken Japanese, making scrubbing motions. You wash. New clothes. He pointed to a large concrete building at the edge of the camp. Steam rose from vents on its roof, disappearing into the morning air. Fear rippled through the prisoners. The building looked industrial, mechanical, strange. The steam made some men think of gas chambers. They had heard rumors about camps in Europe where prisoners were killed in large groups. What if the Americans did the same thing here? I don't trust this, whispered a prisoner named Goto. Why do they need a special building just to wash us? Why the steam? Maybe it's disinfectant, Kenji said, trying to sound calm. But even the medic looked nervous. For the lice. Takashi stepped forward. As the highest-ranking soldier in the group, he felt responsible. I'll go first, he announced. If something happens to me, the rest of you will know. It was the samurai way. The leader faces danger first. Bobby seemed to understand the gesture. He nodded with respect and led Takashi to the building entrance. The other prisoners watched silently as their sergeant disappeared inside. The interior was like nothing Takashi had ever seen. The walls were covered in white tiles that reflected bright electric lights. The air was warm and humid. Rows of metal pipes ran along the ceiling, and strange fixtures hung from them at regular intervals. The floor had drains every few feet. Everything was clean, almost gleaming. An American soldier stood inside, older than Bobby, with gray hair. He smiled and spoke through hand gestures since no interpreter was present. He pointed to Takashi's filthy uniform and made a taking off motion. Takashi hesitated, then understood. He needed to remove his clothes. Standing naked in front of the enemy felt humiliating, but Takashi obeyed. His uniform was stiff with dirt, sweat, and blood. It had holes and tears from weeks of combat. When he took it off, he realized how thin he had become. His ribs showed clearly. Sores covered his skin from lice bites and infections. The American soldier handed him a bar of white soap and a towel, then led him to one of the metal fixtures hanging from the pipes. He reached up and turned a handle. Water suddenly burst from the fixture, spraying down from above. Takashi jumped back in shock. The American laughed gently and demonstrated again, adjusting the handle. He put his hand under the water and showed Takashi it was safe. Slowly, carefully, Takashi stepped under the water. It was warm. No, it was hot. Hot water was pouring down on him from above, like standing in a warm rainstorm. The sensation was incredible. For months, he had only washed with cold water from buckets or streams, and never with enough to really get clean. This water just kept coming, endless, flowing over his entire body at once. The American showed him how to adjust the temperature by turning the handles. Hot water from one side, cold from the other. Takashi could control it. He turned it hotter, and the water became almost burning. Then he adjusted it to a perfect warm temperature. Steam rose around him. He stood there for a moment, just feeling the water. Then he remembered the soap. He had almost forgotten what real soap felt like. Military soap in Japan had been rationed, and for the last year, his unit had used sand or nothing at all. This American soap was smooth and white. When he rubbed it on his skin, it created thick lather, bubbles that spread easily. The dirt began to wash away, turning the water at his feet brown as it swirled down the drain. Takashi washed his hair, his face, his body. He scrubbed places that had been dirty for so long he had forgotten what clean felt like. The hot water soothed his sore muscles. The soap cut through layers of grime. He watched the water at his feet gradually run clearer as the dirt washed away. The lice that had tormented him for months were drowning and washing down the drain. Time seemed to stop. Takashi didn't know how long he stood there. The American guard didn't rush him. More guards brought in other prisoners, and soon the room filled with men experiencing the same shock. Hiroshi was next to him, eyes wide with wonder, letting hot water pour over his wounded shoulder. Kenji was methodically scrubbing every inch of his skin, the medic in him appreciating the hygiene. "Sergeant," Hiroshi said quietly, his voice filled with awe. "How is this possible? This much hot water? Where does it all come from?" Takashi had no answer. In Japan, even wealthy families had to heat water in kettles for baths. Public bathhouses carefully rationed their hot water. But here, in a prison camp, water flowed endlessly from the walls, hot and clean, for prisoners to use freely. What kind of nation had resources so abundant they could give unlimited hot water to their enemies? After washing, they were led to another area where American medics waited with bottles of white powder. They dusted each prisoner's hair and body with the powder. It smelled strange, but not unpleasant. Delousing powder, Kenji explained to the others, to kill any remaining lice and eggs. Very effective. Then came new clothes. Not their old uniforms, but American-style clothing. Denim pants, cotton shirts, underwear, socks. Everything was clean and fit reasonably well. The Americans had sizes organized in piles. They even provided toothbrushes and toothpaste, small white tubes with mint flavor. Takashi couldn't remember the last time he had brushed his teeth with real toothpaste. When Takashi stepped outside, transformed, the other prisoners barely recognized him. He was clean, dressed in new clothes, standing straighter. The constant itching from lice was gone. His skin felt new. He looked at his men and nodded. "It's safe. It's just water." Hot water from the walls. One by one, the prisoners went through. Each man came out looking shocked, transformed, almost reborn. The fear gave way to wonder, then to a strange kind of joy. Men who had been soldiers, then prisoners, were now feeling simple human pleasure for the first time in months. The sensation of being clean. That evening, sitting in the barracks in his new clothes, smelling of soap instead of sweat and death, Takashi touched his clean hair. Around him, his men talked excitedly about the showers. Some wanted to go back tomorrow. The camp rules said prisoners could shower twice a week. Twice a week, with hot water and soap provided freely. "Sergeant," Hiroshi said quietly. If they treat prisoners like this, how do they treat their own soldiers? The question hung in the air. Takashi thought about the American guards he had seen, well-fed and relaxed. He thought about the mountains of supplies, the endless ships, the casual waste. He thought about hot water flowing from walls in a prison camp. For the first time, Takashi truly understood that Japan could not win this war. Any nation that could provide such abundance to its prisoners had resources beyond imagination. The propaganda about American weakness and poverty had been lies. The shower had revealed a truth more devastating than any battle loss. Japan was fighting an enemy that lived in a different world, a world of unimaginable wealth and technology. That night, Takashi dreamed of water pouring endlessly from the ceiling, washing away everything he had believed. 3 weeks had passed since Takashi first experienced the American showers. Life in the POW camp had settled into a routine that would have seemed impossible during his months of combat. Wake at dawn, breakfast of eggs and bread, work details in the camp garden or kitchen, lunch, more work, shower every 3 days, dinner, and evening free time. The routine was almost peaceful, but peace brought time to think, and thinking brought questions that troubled Takashi deeply. The work details were not hard. The Americans needed prisoners to help grow vegetables for the camp food supply. Takashi found himself assigned to a farm plot with 20 other prisoners, under the supervision of an older American guard named Thomas. Thomas had been a farmer in Iowa before the war. He showed the prisoners proper American farming techniques, different from Japanese methods, but effective. Good soil here, Thomas said one morning, holding a handful of dark earth. Bobby Martinez translated for him. Volcanic. Grows almost anything. You men know farming. Many prisoners had been farmers before becoming soldiers. They nodded. Japan was an agricultural nation, and most men knew how to work land. But working as prisoners felt strange. In Japanese military thinking, captured soldiers were already dead to their families and nation. Yet here they were, growing tomatoes and lettuce under the Hawaiian sun. During lunch breaks, the prisoners would sit in the shade and talk. News from the war filtered into the camp through new prisoners arriving every week. The stories were all bad for Japan. The Americans were advancing across the Pacific, island by island. Japanese forces were being pushed back. Supply lines were cut. Cities in Japan were being bombed by massive American planes called B-29 superfortresses. I heard Tokyo was hit last month. A new prisoner named Suzuki said quietly. He had been captured in the Marshall Islands. The Americans dropped so many bombs that whole neighborhoods burned. Thousands died. Takashi felt his stomach tighten. His wife and daughter lived in Osaka, another major city. If Tokyo was being bombed, Osaka might be next. The war he had thought was far from home was now coming to Japanese soil. Kenji had been working in the camp medical facility, helping American doctors treat prisoners. He had learned a lot about American medicine. They have new drugs, he told Takashi one evening. Penicillin, they call it. It cures infections that would kill a man in days. They have enough to use it freely. In Japan, we don't have anything like this. The contrast was everywhere. The Americans had machines for everything. Trucks to haul supplies instead of men carrying loads on their backs. Refrigerators to keep food fresh. Electric lights instead of candles. Indoor plumbing with flush toilets and sinks with running water. The shower building was just one example of American technology and abundance that on shower days, Takashi had started to see the facility differently. The building wasn't special or luxurious by American standards. It was just basic infrastructure, something American soldiers expected as normal. The guards had their own shower facility that was even better. The abundance that seemed miraculous to the prisoners was ordinary to the Americans. One evening, Bobby Martinez sat with a group of prisoners during free time. He was trying to learn more Japanese, and the prisoners were teaching him in exchange for English lessons. Bobby pulled out photographs of his family in Texas. My father's farm, he said, pointing to a picture. We have tractor, electricity, running water and house. Not rich, just normal. The prisoners studied the photograph. Bobby's family farm looked wealthier than any farming village in Japan. The house was large with glass windows. An automobile sat in front. In the background, you could see electric poles running along the road. This was a normal American family. Bobby, Takashi asked carefully in broken English. All America like this? Bobby thought about it. Not all. We have poor people too. But most families have electric, running water, car. Is normal, not special. The words hit Takashi hard. Japan was fighting a war against a nation where ordinary families had automobiles and electricity, where farmers had machines to do the work of 10 men, where even prisoners got hot showers and regular meals. How could Japan ever win? That question was starting to spread through the camp. In quiet conversations, prisoners discussed the evidence before their eyes. Every week, more prisoners arrived with stories of American firepower and resources. Every day, they saw American waste that would be treasure in Japan. Every shower reminded them of the gap between the two nations. Lieutenant Cooper sometimes visited the camp to check on conditions. He spoke through interpreters with prisoners who were willing to talk. Takashi had been avoiding these conversations, but one day Cooper approached him directly. "Sergeant Yamamoto," Cooper said through the interpreter, "I'd like to speak with you, if you're willing. Not about military information. About something else." Takashi agreed cautiously. They sat in the shade near the barracks. Cooper offered him a cigarette. American cigarettes, smooth and mild compared to the harsh Japanese ones Takashi remembered. "You're a leader among the men here," Cooper said. "They respect you. I want your help making this camp run smoothly." "Why should I help you?" Takashi asked. "You are the enemy." Cooper nodded. "Fair question. But the war won't last forever. When it ends, you'll go home to Japan. The question is what kind of Japan you'll return to. Will it be a Japan destroyed by fighting to the very end? Or a Japan that can rebuild and grow?" The words troubled Takashi. Cooper continued. "This war is already decided, Sergeant. Japan cannot win. The question now is how many people die before it ends. Every Japanese soldier who dies on some island is a man who won't be alive to help rebuild Japan after the war. You think we should give up? Stop fighting." Takashi felt anger rise in him. "I think you should survive," Cooper said simply. "Look around this camp. These men are alive. They're healthy. They're learning things. When the war ends, they can go home and use what they've learned. Japan will need farmers who know modern techniques. It will need medics who know about penicillin and sanitation. It will need leaders who understand how to organize and manage resources efficiently." Takashi smoked the cigarette and said nothing. Cooper stood to leave, but paused. "The shower building impressed you, didn't it? I saw your face that first day. You want to know the truth? That building is 40 years old. We built it in 1903. For 4 decades, American soldiers have considered hot showers basic infrastructure, not luxury. Think about what that means." After Cooper left, Takashi sat for a long time. Around him, the camp continued its routine. Prisoners played cards. Some practiced English. Others wrote letters home that would be censored but eventually sent. Hiroshi was laughing with other young prisoners, healthy now, his wound healed. Kenji was reading an American medical textbook, trying to learn new techniques. That evening, Takashi stood under the hot shower for a long time. The water poured over him, endless and warm. He closed his eyes and thought about Cooper's words. 40 years. Americans had been bathing like this since before Takashi was born. While Japan was still using buckets and bathhouses, Americans had buildings with hot water flowing from walls. While Japanese soldiers were dying of infections on jungle islands, Americans had medicine that cured those infections easily. The water washed over him, but it couldn't wash away the truth. Japan was fighting a war it had already lost, against an enemy that lived in the future. Spring arrived in Hawaii, though the island was warm year-round. For Takashi, the seasons marked time differently now. It was April 1944. He had been a prisoner for 6 months. The war continued across the Pacific, and news was increasingly grim for Japan that a new group of prisoners arrived from Saipan. They were in terrible condition, worse than any group before. Starving, diseased, traumatized. When they were told about the showers, they didn't believe it. They thought it was a trick, that they would be killed. Takashi and his men had to convince them it was real. Standing at the entrance to the shower building, Takashi watched as the new prisoners experienced what he had felt 6 months ago. The shock, the wonder, the tears. One man collapsed under the hot water and cried. Another stood motionless, letting water pour over him for 20 minutes, unable to believe it was real. Later, Takashi spoke with their leader, a lieutenant named Ishida. "How bad is it out there?" Takashi asked. Ishida's face was hollow. "Bad. Very bad. On Saipan, we had no supplies for 3 months. American planes and ships surrounded us. We ate grass and insects. Men died of starvation while the Americans dropped bombs. When they finally invaded, it was a massacre. Thousands of Japanese soldiers and civilians died. Some civilians jumped off cliffs rather than surrender. They believed the Americans would torture them. But we know that's not true, Takashi said quietly. The Americans don't torture prisoners. Yes, Ishida said, looking around the camp. I see that now. If only those people on Saipan had known. If only they had seen this place. Thousands died for nothing, believing lies. The conversation stayed with Takashi. He thought about all the Japanese soldiers still fighting, still dying, believing they were fighting barbaric enemies. They didn't know the truth. They couldn't see what he saw every day. That week, Lieutenant Cooper organized something new. He called it a cultural exchange program. Prisoners who were interested could teach Americans about Japanese culture, and Americans would teach prisoners about American life. It was voluntary, and many prisoners refused, considering it collaboration with the enemy. But Takashi decided to join. Kenji was already teaching American medics about traditional Japanese medicine and treatment methods. Hiroshi was learning modern farming techniques from Thomas. Now Takashi found himself in a classroom with Bobby Martinez and several other guards, teaching them about Japanese military structure, not for intelligence purposes, but for cultural understanding. In exchange, Bobby taught them about American democracy, about voting and elections, about how the American government worked. It was strange and confusing. People choose their leaders? Takashi asked. Even common people vote. Everyone votes, Bobby explained. Rich, poor, farmer, factory worker. Everyone has a say. That's democracy. The concept was radical. In Japan, the emperor was divine. The military ruled. Common people had no voice. But Bobby spoke of it as normal, as obvious. In America, the people had power. Maybe that's why American soldiers fought differently. They were fighting for something they had chosen, not something imposed on them. One afternoon, Takashi was working in the garden when he heard shouting from the camp entrance. Guards were running. Something important was happening. The prisoners gathered, worried. Had something terrible happened? Was the war coming here? Cooper came to address them, his face serious. I wanted you to hear this from me directly, he said through the interpreter. Allied forces have landed in France. It's called D-Day. American, British, and Canadian forces are invading German-occupied Europe. The war in Europe is entering its final phase. The prisoners absorbed this information. Germany was Japan's ally. If Germany was being invaded, if the European war was ending, that meant America could focus all its power on the Pacific. The full weight of American industry and military would turn toward Japan. The thought was terrifying. That night, the prisoners talked quietly among themselves. How much longer can Japan fight? Goto asked. The Americans are advancing everywhere. Our navy is destroyed. Our air force is gone. Cities are being bombed. Now Germany is being invaded. We're alone. The emperor will never surrender, another prisoner said. We will fight to the last man. And what then? Takashi asked. The men turned to look at him. What happens when the last man is dead? Who rebuilds Japan? Who takes care of our families? Who grows the food and teaches the children? The questions hung in the air. Takashi continued. Lieutenant Cooper asked me something months ago. He asked what kind of Japan I want to return to. A Japan destroyed completely? Or a Japan that can survive and grow? I've been thinking about that question every day. You sound like you think we should surrender, Goto said accusingly. I think we should survive, Takashi said. Look at what we've learned here. Modern farming, American medicine, English language, organization and efficiency. If we go home, we can use this knowledge. We can help rebuild, but only if we're alive. The conversation spread through the camp over the following weeks. Prisoners divided into groups. Some remained loyal to the emperor and the military code, refusing to consider anything but fighting to the death. Others, especially the longer-term prisoners, began to think differently. They had seen too much, learned too much, understood too much. Takashi found himself becoming a bridge between these groups. He maintained respect for Japanese tradition and honor, but he also spoke openly about what they had witnessed. The American abundance wasn't luck or theft. It was the result of technology, organization, and a system that used resources efficiently. Japan would need to learn these lessons to survive after the war. On a warm evening in July, Takashi took his regular shower. The water flowed over him, hot and clean as always. But now it didn't shock him. It was normal. He had become accustomed to it. That realization itself was shocking. He had adapted to American standards in just 6 months. What did that say about human nature? About the possibility of change? As he dried off and dressed in his clean clothes, Takashi thought about his family. Were they still alive? Was Osaka being bombed? He had been allowed to send one censored letter, telling them he was alive and well. He didn't know if they received it. The uncertainty was painful, but he knew something his family didn't know yet. He knew the war would end. He knew Japan would lose. He knew life would change dramatically. And he knew that the men in this camp, the survivors, would be needed to help Japan rebuild. They had learned things most Japanese people had never seen. They had experienced a different world. Walking back to his barracks under the stars, Takashi made a decision. He would survive. He would learn everything he could. And when the war ended, whenever that was, he would go home and help build a new Japan. A Japan with hot water flowing from walls, with medicine that cured infections, with efficient farming and modern technology. A Japan that could feed its people and give them decent lives. The shower building stood in the distance, steam rising from its vents into the night sky. It had taught Takashi more than any classroom could. It had shown him the truth about the world, about progress, about what was possible when resources were used wisely. He thought about the prisoners who would arrive tomorrow or next week, how they would react to their first hot shower, how they would stand in disbelief as water poured over them, how their world would shift, just as his had shifted. Each man experiencing that moment of understanding, that crack in their certainty about how the world worked. In the barracks, Hiroshi was writing a letter home. Kenji was studying his medical books by electric light. Other prisoners were playing cards, talking quietly, or sleeping peacefully. They were prisoners, yes, but they were alive. They were learning. They were changing. The war would end someday. The question was what they would do with what they had learned. Takashi looked at his men and felt something he hadn't felt since the battle that led to his capture. He felt hope, not for victory in war, but for survival and what might come after. Outside, American guards walked their rounds. The camp was quiet and orderly. Tomorrow would bring more work, more learning, more slow adaptation to this strange new world. And every few days, the showers would remind them of the vast difference between what they had known and what was possible. That knowledge, uncomfortable as it was, might be the most valuable thing they could take home when this long war finally ended.